With nationwide protests against police brutality being the focus of so many conversations, GSBA is proud to welcome experts today who are at the forefront of conversations around excessive force, de-escalation efforts, and police accountability in Seattle and Washington State. Rapid Response is streaming both live on Facebook and Zoom. So throughout the hour, please feel free to ask any questions utilizing the Q&A features. Terea and I will follow along, doing our best to make sure that we're able to get answers for your questions. Now, allow me to turn things over to today's guest Rapid Response moderator, GSBA's Director of Public Policy and Government Relations, and member of Washington State's LGBTQ Commission, Matt Landers.
Thank you very much, Joey and Terea, for starting this today. Again, my name is Matt Landers. I use he, him pronouns. As GSBA and the Capitol Hill Business Alliance have watched the police violently respond to legitimate protesters over the last nearly 2 weeks, we have been outraged. We sent a letter to our city leadership yesterday reflecting many of the policy priorities developed by Black, Indigenous, and people of color organizations who've been most impacted by this violence and who have been the policy leaders on this. Some of these points include ceasing all actions against the protesters, including physical attacks, arrests, prosecution, and incarceration, prohibiting the use of any gas, flashbang grenades, rubber bullets, and other violent methods, prohibiting the extraction of badge numbers by officers for any reason, ensuring that police union contracts live up to the promises made to the community, that reforms recommended by the Community Police Commission and in the Accountability Law in 2017 are fully enacted, that all other requirements of the 2017 Accountability Law are followed through with, and then I think most importantly, begin the efforts to seriously demilitarize the Seattle Police Department through its equipment, training, and behavior, and to start redirecting funds from the police department where a law enforcement approach is not serving our communities. We are incredibly proud to have with us for this webinar today several of the leaders of these efforts who've been leading from the community, from the official bodies established in the city to do this, and that they are the real experts in this work and have been working at this for a long time. So we are so excited to have them be able to share their work with us. So I'd like to ask our guests to take about 2 minutes to introduce yourselves with your names, your pronouns, your affiliations, and why you're involved in this work. We'll just go down the line. We'll start with Leslie, then go to Monisha, Alina, and then Megan. Thank you all.
Okay, this is Leslie Cushman. I'm the citizen sponsor of Initiative 940. So I worked with a group and filed the initiative at the Secretary of State, was on a campaign team and with Monisha, Harrell, and many others that brought the initiative to the ballot, and it was a big success. We know, and we knew at the time, there was lots of work to be done to improve it, and we've reformed a coalition that includes as our main goal to put the issues of families and communities at the front. And this coalition includes the family of Charlene Lyles, the family of Giovanni Joseph McDade, the family of Daniel Covarrubias, and others. So I am working in a facilitator role in this coalition, and I'm happy to be here today to answer questions. Thank you.
Hi there. My name is Monisha Harrell. I am the board chair for Equal Rights Washington. I also have served or am serving as the chair of the National LGBTQ Task Force Action Fund. I was on the leadership team for Initiative 940, which our leadership team, our organization was called De-Escalate Washington. As Leslie had just mentioned, the goal of that particular initiative was to require de-escalation training for all law enforcement officers in Washington State, as well as add anti-bias training and first aid, the requirement to render first aid as soon as possible if somebody has been injured in an altercation with law enforcement. I am a new member of the Seattle Community Police Commission and served on this selection committee for the Seattle Inspector General, which was part of the requirements of the consent decree. Equal Rights Washington, one of the reasons that I've been at the table in this work, in my role as chair of Equal Rights Washington, is that as the statewide LGBTQ advocacy organization, we have 4 priority areas, and those priority areas are trans justice, LGBTQ youth empowerment, racial equity, and gender equity. And just for today, I'll focus on the racial equity portion of it. Over 30% of our LGBTQ community are communities of color, and so we have to step up and do the work of such a significant portion of our community. If we are not doing the work of over 30% of our community, then we really aren't doing the work. And so we adopted racial equity as one of our priority areas in 2013, at the end of 2013, and have been at these tables to ensure that progress is able to be moved forward, and that our expertise legislatively and from a policy perspective, that we can bring that to bear in these efforts. So thank you so much for having me today.
Great. My name is Alina. My pronouns are he, him, his. I am the Director of Racial Equity for Seattle Center. And I have also been on the Community Police Commission for a little over a year now. I'm also on the board of Fabian's Fund. Fabian's Fund was started by a woman whose brother was incarcerated. He ended up killing himself in prison, and she, from there on, dedicated her life to really advocating and serving Black and brown communities to keep young people from getting into the system, but specifically through the lens of like Black and brown communities and people who are most impacted by violence. So Fabian's Fund does a lot of work with the Black Prisoner Caucus chapters across the state. I believe there's now a BPC chapter in each prison. And then how that connects back to me being part of the work. I really try to think about this work in an intersectional way. So not just people who haven't been impacted by the system yet, but people who are currently impacted, definitely juvenile justice. How do we defer kids out of that system and ensure that they have a community that's really going to hold and support them once they're released. As far as my role as a commissioner, I approach my work in a really interesting way, which might be contentious for some people, but based on the work that the racial equity work that I do with predominantly white folks, I think the only way for me to really have conversations about systemic racism, institutional racism, and how that intersects with policing is to build personal relationships with folks. So I think sometimes my approach to the work is really trying to meet people where they are as individuals so that we can talk about broader concepts and moving that work forward. As a trans, Latinx, queer person, I think it is also very important to me that the communities that I represent and the communities I stand in solidarity with have a voice at the table. So that's really what has connected me to the Community Police Commission.
Hi, my name's Megan Dawson. I am an attorney with the Lavender Rights Project, which is a local nonprofit that is by and for the trans and queer community. We provide direct services to our community in a variety of legal areas, but we also focus on community programming and advocacy. And we have a current project, the Black Trans Task Force of Washington, which is a newer initiative that we are proud to be hosting and supporting. And we are, I think, a little bit outside of this commission world. I'm not on the commission, and we are very much advocating for Black trans Indigenous populations who are most impacted by this police brutality. So thank you for having me.
Thank you very much, everyone. for being with us this morning. Just want to put a reminder out there, Leslie Cushman's video is not working today, so we will just have her on the microphone, but we're thankful to have her in whatever capacity we can. So I want to start this conversation with Monisha and Alina, representing the Community Police Commission. Could you give us the background of the CPC in Seattle, what its charge is, what its role is as the community voice, and what its place is in the larger accountability structure in Seattle?
Oh my gosh. Okay, I'm going to try to do this as concisely as possible. So I'm just going to watch the clock because this is 10 plus years of like, well, yeah, of actual tangible work that we can put on paper, but this work has been happening, I think, since the creation of police in regards to like slave patrol. So this is a really long history. So I'm going to give you the very concise version. This was a big, this work was a very steep learning curve, I think, for all the new commissioners last year. There are a lot of things that we're still learning as commissioners, so it's not a surprise to me that community folks wouldn't have that information or the way that it is put out. I'm not a lawyer like Megan, so sometimes people say words I'm like, I don't know what that means. So, okay, brief history. The CPC really got its start in 2010. The murder of John T. Williams, who was a First Nations wood carver, sparked that along with some other issues. The DOJ decided to do an investigation. In 2011, the DOJ completed its investigation and found that there were a pattern of practices that were constitutional violations of people, and that they had very serious concerns around biased policing. So in 2012, the city entered an agreement, which was the consent decree, to essentially implement reforms that would hold SPD accountable to fully complying with the United States Constitution, which seems like an easy win there, effectively ensure the public and officer safety, so everyone's safe, and then also promoting public confidence. So those were the things that the consent decree was supposed to address. That was in 2012. In 2013, the CPC was formed. The mayor appointed, at that time it was just mayoral appointees, and they appointed 15 commissioners. One commissioner was from the SPMA, which represents leadership within SPD. And then one commissioner was held for the Seattle Police Officers Guild, which is SPOG. So there were at least 2 police officers that were comprised in that 15 commission. In 2017, the CPC, Community Police Commission, was made permanent, and we went up to 21 commissioners, still having a place for SPOG and for SPMA. Forgive me, I don't know what SPMA stands for, probably Seattle Police Management Associate. I'm not sure, but that really has leadership in it. SPOG has everyone else. So that was in 2017. A lot of things happened in between then, but in 2019, a federal judge, Judge Robart, found that the city was out of compliance. And a lot of that has to do with the contracts that were put forward, that were approved, really were backtracking on the accountability measures that this work since 2010 had been working towards. The whole, thank you, Seattle Police Management Association. Oh, that's good guess. So fast forward to where we are now. And just for context, really the vision of the CPC is that our communities and the police are aligned in shared goals of safety, of accountability, of respect. And I think a lot of folks would argue that that vision is not one that is currently taking place. Our mission as commissioners is really to listen to amplify the voices of communities that are most impacted by policing, so that communities coming to the table with us. Those are important notes to make. And then I guess the other thing I will add in there really quickly Let's see if that helps. Really quickly is that the CPC, Community Police Commission, has we're kind of we're in a trifecta of accountability partners. So it's the Office of Police Accountability, also known as OPA, the Office of Inspector General, which was created out of that accountability law, and then the CPC. And we all work together to ensure that, to really fight for there to be transparency and accountability based on SPD policies and behavior of individual officers. So the Office of Police Accountability, OPA, really has authority over allegations of misconduct, and that could be referring to federal, state, or local law. They're overseeing all of those complaints. I'm sure people know by now they've got 12, maybe 14,000 plus complaints weekend before last, so they're very busy. The OPA is led by a civilian director, so he's not a police officer, but he works with, there are civilian investigators, and then there are sergeants within the police department, and they do joint investigations, which I can understand that being a source of contention for community members also. And then the last thing is the Office of Inspector General, and they're really charged with auditing how the system is working. So I have 3 things written down that I wanted to share. So they essentially, they audit the police department, they audit the OPA, and then they work together to improve those policies and audit systems to make sure that the systems that are in place are actually working based in equity, compassion, and fairness. And if they're not, that's what those audit reports come into play. So having the OIG in addition to the OPA and the CPC really makes us as a trifecta really a lot more effective. So Office of Police Accountability, Inspector General, you'll hear them called OPA or OIG, and then CPC is the Community Police Commission. That's a very condensed version, but the 3 of us are supposed to work together to really, and will be currently to address the 30-day moratorium on tear gas, or CS gas. It's also being referred to moving forward, in addition to a lot of other things that we need to address right now.
Thank you, Alina. And again, thank you for those acronyms. And again, for everybody watching us, the CPC is the Community Police Commission, OPA, Office of Police Accountability, and then OIG, Office of the Inspector General. There's a lot of acronyms in this policy work. We want to make sure that we are speaking so we can make sure everyone's understanding us. So Monisha, on to you. What are some of the ways that the CPC is reacting to the current protests? And you have spoken very eloquently about the need for transparency specifically. What can you share with us about what's going on right now?
So I just want to say the Community Police Commission is remarkably important for a few different reasons. It is when the Department of Justice came in to basically negotiate the consent decree with the city of Seattle. One of the biggest problems with our police force, and quite honestly with police forces around the country, is that there's a lack of transparency. There's a lack of insight into how law enforcement is doing its job, into how it's policing people. And a lot of the change that we're getting right now is coming from unveiling all of that mystery, right? It's coming from cameras. It's coming from the knowledge that the community now has about how policing is being done. So transparency, pulling back that veil, is really the most important part of being able to offer and provide constitutional policing. So there were a couple of different methods. There is a judge who is providing oversight to the legal framework of the consent decree, but the Community Police Commission is not supposed to be necessarily. It's supposed to be the community, right? It's not supposed to be all law enforcement. It's not supposed to be necessarily lawyers, but our law enforcement is accountable to the community. the community has to have oversight and transparency into what is going on to ensure that there is not just constitutional policing, but community policing. The question that this answers, that we have to ensure is being answered, is who does law enforcement serve and who are they accountable to? That is the most important part of all of this work, right? Who do they serve and who are they accountable to? With a community police commission, it ensures that there are community members who are actively looking at what law enforcement does and how they behave. What makes a community police commission even more effective is when that body has teeth. There are other jurisdictions that are looking into adding community police commissions across Washington state without having to do it under the rule of a consent decree. It is a lot of people are acknowledging it as a best practice to ensure constitutional policing. And so there are many jurisdictions who are realizing that there is a problem there, who are looking to adding those bodies. And that really kind of segues into what it is that the Seattle Community Police Commission does. It is a body that is supposed to push for and advocate for and ensure transparency in the work being done by the Seattle Police Department. And it's one of the additional elements of Initiative 940 that passed in at the end of 2018, which is if there is lethal use of force by an officer or a police department, that it is independently investigated. That, and again, that's transparency, that's trusting, that's being able to trust the process, that's knowing that there shouldn't be any conflicts of interest in these investigations, so that they are being done honestly and with integrity. But that transparency is the root of all things, and that is really the primary role and responsibility of the Community Police Commission, is to bring that transparency forward.
Thank you, Monisha. I think that provided a great segue to go over to Leslie. Leslie, can you tell us a little bit about the Initiative 940 and De-Escalate Washington campaigns? And so then what are the accountability measures that we're working on statewide, not just in the city of Seattle? And I think it's also important to give you the chance to talk about how these campaigns really centered the communities and those most impacted and their voices. You mentioned that in your introduction, but we'd love to hear a little bit more about that.
Very good. Yes, there's a distinction about local control versus statewide legislation. And police agencies are similar to school boards, where you get a lot of local control. And that's good in one sense, that the community is close to the policing agencies. But for some of these critical issues around police use of force and training standards and investigation standards, when we're dealing with human rights or the issues of excessive use of force, we need statewide standards. And so the people working on Initiative 940, which really grew out of uses of force in many communities. A lot of folks think about the Seattle consent decree. Well, there was also a consent decree in Spokane due to the death of a person with intellectual disabilities, Otto Zim. And there was, the Department of Justice came to the city of Pasco due to the killing of Antonio Zambrano Montes. And the Department of Justice had a consent decree across the Columbia River in Portland. So one of the, I'll just add this as an aside, but when we sit down with law enforcement, they try to differentiate the Pacific Northwest from Baltimore, from Chicago, from Detroit, and we bring them right back to what's going on here. We have the same problems and the same issues. So a couple things we did with the initiative, we framed it around principles of sanctity of life. So we, as Monisha mentioned, it has a requirement to render first aid at the scene. That wasn't a requirement. And many of the testimonies we heard from families is that police officers would step over the bleeding bodies and the dying bodies of their loved ones. And that indifference was totally unacceptable. And so we addressed that in the initiative. We addressed training standards, and training, police culture is a huge issue. And training is consistent statewide through the Criminal Justice Training Commission in Burien. But training isn't always an effective solution. But since training is going on, we required de-escalation training and training for mental health crisis situations. The initiative itself called out issues of race and policing. And when we, so it was de-escalation training, mental health training, first aid training, the requirement for first aid. Then the initiative addressed what was known as a de facto immunity, where police officers were not being charged in the state for use of deadly force. And they're not being charged yet, even though the initiative is passed. So we have been working with prosecutors and investigation teams to understand what's going on there. We're going to be supporting, and I think, Monisha, it's fair for us to be able to tell people now that we're going to be supporting completely independent investigation, separate and apart from police. The families are who we are listening to, and the communities impacted by police violence are who we are listening to. And they have said police should not be investigating police. And it actually is probably not humanly possible to fairly and impartially investigate your colleagues. And we heard the governor announce that he is supportive of that now. We were going to be working on that. So the initiative itself doesn't allow for that. It excluded the involved agency itself from an investigation, but it didn't set up a mechanism to totally get police out of the investigations. And we think that's the necessary next step. Interesting piece of the initiative is it set up a framework for community stakeholders, and it specifically called out in state law persons with disabilities, members of the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer community, persons of color, immigrants, non-citizens, Native Americans, youth, and formerly incarcerated persons. And that list is reflective of the data of who is impacted by police violence. And you know it doesn't, so it really establishes priorities for who should be listened to. I could ask me some questions. What else should I be talking about at this point? So that's the framework for the initiative.
Can I jump in for a
yes,
minute?
Please.
So one of the things I wanted to add, and you touched upon it, but I wanted to add, is the importance of the independent investigation. So one of the things that we found is that law enforcement officers, they don't stay usually in one department for the entirety of their career. So when we're saying, well, if there is a lethal use of force incident in the Seattle Police Department, so Seattle shouldn't investigate that. Well, if it's another law enforcement agency that's investigating that, let's say it's King County, chances are there are officers that were working in Seattle or King County, and that they may have gotten a promotion or moved to a different jurisdiction. They are not completely independent because there's a lot of shifting that goes on within those departments. There's a lot of promotions and movements across law enforcement agencies. The other thing is they all train at the same place. They all train at the Community Justice Training Center, which means they are training with officers, building relationships with officers from jurisdictions all over the state. So completely independent should be exactly completely independent. And the way we get that is by not having law enforcement officers investigating themselves.
Let me step in and say it's also a statewide issue because it's important in every community of the state. So that's why we need this statewide framework. The shortcomings of 940 were that we excluded the involved agency and we said it had to be independent, but we didn't lay out any criteria. We established in the law that the Criminal Justice Training Commission was supposed to do rulemaking, and it brought all these stakeholders to the table, including law enforcement. And we put in all sorts of, the community pushed for all sorts of mitigating factors to inoculate against this bias, but it's not enough. It's not enough to, we think it's impossible to a colleague to investigate another colleague. So I'll tell you what those factors, those mechanisms were. We require communities to be involved in somehow in the investigation team. And the WAC, so WAC is state law, it becomes part of the law. It's these criteria were adopted in the Washington Administrative Code. Includes a conflict of interest assessment, includes communication protocols that address the police narrative, where so one of the issues, these are criminal investigations of police, and the police have traditionally treated the victim as the suspect, and we need to switch that around, and it's a big culture change for police. And again, I've heard some people say it'll take 15 years for this training to make a difference. We can't wait 15 years. We need the independent investigation to happen now, and we need, so we've all been talking about the defunding movement as well, and how it relates to this situation. Anyway, I will put myself on mute.
Now I want to make sure we give Megan a chance to talk about the position of Lavender Rights Projects and their work. They are not part of the Community Police Commission, as they mentioned, but their clients, their staff are very much on the front lines of this and have been for a long time. So Megan, can you please share with us some of your experiences and Lavender Rights experiences with these issues? And after that, we will move on to audience questions.
Thank you. Yeah, so I've been listening to a lot of the other panelists, and what has struck me as a consistent issue is these attempts to mitigate, these attempts to reform and enact accountability, just having officers wearing video recording equipment. These actions have not produced a reduction in the loss of Black and Brown trans lives. And we don't know if that's ever going to happen. And I think that we are in a position where without the abolition of the police force and without some kind of law reforming the qualified immunity of police officers and the state from restitution for individuals who do lose their lives or are harmed by the state, there's really nothing that is going to change in any substantial way. And so the only real, I mean, we were just talking about it, but the only real action that I think is going to take any kind of is going to achieve any kind of actual transformative justice for our communities is a defunding of the police, a defunding of the prosecutor's office, defunding of the DEA, dismantling of the drug laws that are incredibly racist across this country, the release of people from prisons, that has to be done as soon as possible. And the complete overhaul of the budget that's been allocated to these police forces that has done almost nothing to change police culture. We believe that the culture is poisoned, that police culture is virus, and it's not going away anytime soon without taking away their resources, cutting them off at the knees, and essentially preventing these atrocities from happening. We can't lose any more lives. We can't lose any more of our precious community, our precious trans lives who are most impacted by the violence and the misgendering in the police force, in the prison system, the targeting of those communities with these laws. And we are really, I know we've been talking about this for a long time. It feels like it's been, at least 10 years that this has been a national conversation about police reform. And the lack of transparency isn't the issue. We have transparency, but without any kind of way to hold accountable the not just the individual actors, but the entire system, which is doing its job as it's designed to do. Without any way to hold them accountable, there's not going to be any change. And so the only way that we really have at this point is to take that money away from them and to reinvest it in our communities and organizations that are serving trans Black communities. We are asking that all protesters, all trans, non-binary protesters that are currently in custody are released and they're not prosecuted, and that there be a seat at the table at every single table that allows for our community to advocate for ourselves and prioritizing our social services. And I'm seeing in the comments that I agree, there are places that have removed the police as the primary law and order strategy. Camden, New Jersey did this 7 years ago, and that's something that we can look to as an example. Minneapolis, the only reason that we're seeing that defunding of police is because there are 2 Black trans people on that city council, and they are there doing the work. Without Black trans folks as members of these governing bodies and in positions of real leadership and real power, we're not going to see these changes, and it's just going to be more of the same. And I think we've all seen what happens when it's more of the same, is we get a national uprising like we have right now. Thank you.
So I wanted to add something there. The saying, absolute power corrupts absolutely. That's what we're seeing, right? If you haven't seen it yet, it is, or if you haven't heard of it yet, I actually think it's an old documentary, but Quiet Rage is a documentary which documents the Stanford experiment, which shows what happens when you create this system of absolute power that we see in our current law enforcement system. And so I just want to say that Megan hit this on the head with, there's no one piece of legislation, there is no one action that is going to fix this problem. This is a systemic problem that our country is built upon. And the whole foundation has to be reimagined, has to be repaired. And so when we have this system where we have put one body in the position to be at the absolute top of the food chain without question, without transparency, without accountability, this is what we get. And so we have to put control back in the power, back in the hands of our community to ensure that this absolute power and this increased militarization of our law enforcement is not poisoning our society.
Thank you. And now I would like to turn it over to Terea, who has been gathering questions from our Zoom participants and from our Facebook Live participants. So go ahead, Terea.
Thanks, Matt. I have received several questions. This one is from Monisha. Transparency seems to be key. Some have noticed during streaming events that police have been reluctant to allow ambulance and other aid vehicles through. How are we able to know whether policies for medical aid and transgender policies are being followed?
I go back to what I just said. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. There should be no way that public health takes a back seat to anything that law enforcement does or says. Ambulances, first aid, I have seen law enforcement agencies across the country denying protesters basic needs like water. That is a tactic. It's a power tactic. It's a control tactic that they're using to deprive people of basic needs so that they are uncomfortable and they will want to leave, right? So they won't want to stay there, so they won't be able to stay in place. Protest is our free speech. It is our right in this country to protest. It is our legacy in this country to be able to protest. And so it is a tactic, and it is quite candidly, it's not legal.
Thank you, Monisha. Okay, here's another one. Do you happen to know if the mental health training takes into consideration aging seniors who have a higher rate of Alzheimer's and or dementia?
I will address that. I don't know the specific answer to that, and that is a good question. I am going to find out and let you know. And I know it is around crisis. It's crisis oriented, and the Criminal Justice Training Commission is using for right now, because of COVID, everything is a little different. They've just started their in-person classes again. They are bringing National Alliance of Mental Illness techniques and personnel and staff and volunteers into the classroom for lived experiences. So they're dealing, they're not in a textbook, they're not looking at webinars, they are having interactive classes with individuals, which I think is valuable, puts a face on it. And I'm gonna follow up and I'll let the GSBA know the answer to this so you can share it with people. I'm gonna ask right now, okay?
Sounds great. Okay, here's another one for you. Do you believe the CPC has been given the necessary tools to effectively ensure the Seattle Police Department accountability to the community?
No. Also, did I find my mic? Can you hear me better now? I hope. Yeah, I think a lot of the power, honestly, which is something that I'm grappling with too, lies a lot in bargaining. So who's the arbitrator that gets to be in that collective bargaining process between the city and the police department? I'm so sorry. I have a 7-month-old puppy. So I apologize about that. Yeah, I don't think that the CPC has the tools that they need. However, I will say that the CPC, we had a meeting last Wednesday. Usually we have, like, including the 21 commissioners and staff, maybe a couple of guests, we maybe have 40 people that show up to those, and we had almost 400 last week, where we had to shut down the Zoom and start a different one. So what I would say is that people need to continue to do that. I would say people need to continue to be on the streets and putting pressure, because within 24 hours of, like, those initial protests, after the city was called in on what was happening, the curfew ended, the city pulled out of the consent decree, there was a pause on CS gas. That wasn't after the very first protest, but that immediately following that first round where we call people in. So people being in the streets, people showing up to the CPC meetings definitely, I think, increases our voice. The mayor and the chief showed up on that call unannounced. I did not know that they were going to be there. And I think that that was great for them to say, everything that they did in front of almost 400 community members. So now it's not just folks on the CPC that are like, actually, that's not what happened, but community folks who had the privilege of having Wi-Fi access, who had the privilege of even being on that call during the middle of the day, were able to hear what they were saying. And that really, I think, empowers the CPC to do more work, but it can't stop. Like, we need people to continue to support the work that we're all trying to do collectively.
Thank you so much, Alina. Here's a question from Mitch Hunter. The question is asking, what about those that are considered hard of hearing or deaf or transgender that, you know, are considered protected classes, whose membership may be invisible? How would they be able to gain protection?
So one of the things I'll say is that if you're talking about protection by law enforcement, those factors shouldn't matter. We do know that they mattered in the murder of John T. Williams. But one of the things that with Initiative 940, so there's no one initiative that's going to do everything, but one of the things that it did that we pushed for was anti-bias training. And anti-bias training that for law enforcement that includes the LGBTQ community and specifically the trans community. This has been a huge weakness in training by the Criminal Justice and Training Center, and so they're not going to understand how to engage with and interact respectfully with community without training. And so that's something that we mandated through that initiative. So it's a long process.
I can jump in too, Monisha.
Yes, please do.
So I just heard back from Sue Rahr at the Criminal Justice Training Commission, and they do cover this issue with the elderly and Alzheimer's, and so she got back to me immediately, and she can get more detail if you need to know. Monisha's talking about the implementation work we did, and it's WAC 13911, and it includes training on dealing with persons who have barriers to hearing, understanding, or otherwise complying with law enforcement officers. That's the exact words. And we were interested in intellectual disabilities, physical disabilities, psychiatric disabilities, and the other lists there. We tried to focus on communication tactics. We had a large scuffle with law enforcement around the issue of comply. They have this threshold of, well, you didn't comply. They weren't complying. And Monisha will remember we had this scuffle with them, and we had to prioritize what we were gonna scuffle about, and we were adamant that members of the public who don't actually have a requirement to comply in order to be treated and receive de-escalation tactics. And so that was one of our focuses, and our focuses were communication with, if you are in a state of mind that you can't comply, it doesn't mean you're gonna get shot. It means they have to use different tactics in order to keep you safe. If you have a language barrier and can't comply, they have to use tactics to keep you safe. So that was one of our big focuses. Monisha, you can add more if you want.
Well, and I was just going to say that, you know, in brief, a mental illness or a mental break should not be a death sentence. And that is critical, right? Law enforcement and the scuffle around comply was, again, going back to the absolute power quote, citizens going about their business who are not breaking the law shouldn't be forced into a submissive role to comply with somebody who's giving them an order just to give an order, right? That's not the sort of society that we should be living in. And so changing law enforcement mindset from demanding citizens comply with them if they are not breaking the law, just because they may not be doing what you want them to do, doesn't make them a criminal.
Those are powerful words. Thank you so much for sharing that, both Leslie and Monisha. I have a question that is about immunity. What is qualified immunity, and do we have it in Washington State?
I can try to answer that. I don't actually practice this area for the most part, but my understanding is qualified immunity is the legal doctrine that we have all over the country that protects the state from being sued for damages. So a tort, also known as an injury law, or an injury that you would normally be able to sue someone, for example, that, you know, had a faulty wire hanging above a sidewalk, for example. You could sue somebody who owned the land and, you know, created this dangerous condition, or things like wrongful death. Those are examples of citizens, you know, civil actions that you could take to get some kind of legal remedy. And the law has a protection against being able to access that remedy based on a legal doctrine that essentially asks what is the traditional standard, what is the accepted norm of the police department? Is this a standard practice? And so if an officer acts outside of what is the official policy of the police department, which most police departments don't have a police brutality as the official standard, then that officer, the state cannot be liable. And so that's basically how it works. It's a legal doctrine that we've had for a really long time, and there actually is a federal bill that has been introduced to overturn that legal doctrine nationwide. But it is something that you know, who knows what's going to happen with that. And there's no remedy for people right now. There is no way for you to either get compensated financially to hold the state accountable if something horrible happens to you or your loved one right now. And that is why people are so angry. And yeah, that's basically it in a nutshell.
Perfect. Thank you. We've got just a few minutes left in our broadcast now. Thank you to all of our panelists for the work that you've been doing. And I think it's important for all of the viewers to remember that this is something that has been going on for a long time. It will continue to go on. We hope that 400 people keep showing up to the CPC meetings, that people keep showing up, speaking out on behalf of their communities, and pushing our elected officials and our government systems to do better by our communities. Are there any final comments that anyone would like to give before I turn it over to Joey?
I was just going to say, if people do want to attend those meetings, the CPC meetings, they are the first and third Wednesday of each month from 9 to noon. The CPC on the website will release the agenda with a link. So again, this is for folks who have the privilege of having access to the internet or not working from 9 a.m. to noon during the middle of the week. We're pushing to make those meetings more accessible. And I think with COVID, that has been a challenge. But for folks that are interested, first and third Wednesday of every month, 9 to noon, the Community Police Commission will post that on their website with the link for folks to join.
And if I could add one more thing, I just urge everybody to not turn away from this, right? Don't, when this calms down, when this moment calms down, keep your foot on the gas with this. And there's a couple things that law enforcement does in order to create confusion and have people kind of create this sense of disinterest in the issue. And one of them is the tactic of villainizing the victim in public, right? There are a lot of cases where they will say, well, this person had a knife, or this person was behaving irrationally, or they weren't complying, right? They will villainize the victim in an attempt for us to be able to say, well, you know, they brought it upon themselves. I urge you to see through that, to see through that veil of media spin, in order for us to say, but this death is acceptable. First and foremost, these deaths shouldn't be acceptable. And I just want you to know, the ones that we are seeing on camera, just imagine how many that we're not seeing because there was not a camera present. So don't allow the disservice to the families, the disservice to the public, by allowing law enforcement to villainize the victims and make them responsible for their own deaths. I want to thank everybody for being in this moment with us. This is a long journey, and if you need a break, take your break, but please come back. This work is so critically important, and the only way we are going to actually make real long-term effective change is if you take your breaks when you need it, take care of your mental health and your physical health, but that you continue to be in this fight with us for the actual freedom and safety for all of our people.
Thank you so much, Monisha. And now GSBA would like to share more about next week's Rapid Response Program and perhaps some other programs that are relevant to our viewers today. Over to you, Joey.
Thank you so much. And thank you to today's Rapid Response panel. And of course, our guest moderator today, Matt Landers. We appreciate your leadership and insightful perspectives. Viewers, before you log off today from our Rapid Response, there will be a survey that pops up. We do ask you to go ahead and fill that out. It will help us with our future GSBA Rapid Response programming. GSBA does recommend that you tune in this Thursday at 10 a.m. for our new Health and Wellness series, Keeping It Real with host Lindsay T.H. Jackson. This week's episode, How to Do White Allyship. Join us as we discuss white privilege and racial injustice and learn how to assess your role in anti-racism work. Our next GSBA Rapid Response will be Tuesday, June the 16th at 10 a.m. when we welcome Dr. Anne Marie Kimball, a professor emeritus in epidemiology at the University of Washington, to discuss COVID-19 and how it affects our community. Until then, stay home and stay safe.